this is the first class of a class that we're doing on snow with rivers and trees. And we're going to start by doing some masking, and this is a class that I am teaching with students here with me, and so you may hear other voices or see hands or things like that, and the lighting and the video may not be specifically made for YouTube, but I'm putting this up there for the students to use and for anyone else that might want the information. And I quickly wanted to say that I am teaching a class, a workshop for the Louisiana Watercolor Society next September down, I think it's near New Orleans, I'm not sure exact location yet, and then one for a trip to Japan that's an art trip. And that one is a 13-day trip, and it will be pen and ink and watercolor, and we will be drawing and painting on location. And it's a 26-hour art side of the workshop, and then there's lots of touring and things. And so in the Cheap Joe's art catalog that's just come out on page 460 is the two listings if you're interested in those. And you can also always go to my website at LorraineWatryStudio.com to see what other classes I'm teaching, or for look at my artwork and my blog. So we are going to start. We're going to do a techniques page, and before we get going, I have handed out two handouts, and the first one is talking about snow and the fact that even though we think of snow as white, in the shadows on parts of the snow, depending on things that might be reflecting onto it, snow is not always white, and there can be quite a bit of color on it, especially in the shadows. Most of the time in the shadows you'll see blues of some sort. If it is a gray day though, it may be more just in the gray tones. You can adjust it just to give it some color and some life, but atmosphere can play a big role in how the snow looks. And there are different techniques for creating snow. We use wet and wet. We use direct painting where it has hard edges. You might put snow, a color on the snow, and then go back and soften an edge here and there so it has both hard and soft edges. Using masking fluid can be a great way to protect parts of like snow on a tree branch, or you can spatter the masking fluid to create the look of like it's snowing. And it's always fun at the end of a painting once you've done that to remove it and have it actually feel like it's snowing. It's really fun. So I talk about different aspects of doing that on that one. And then on the back's second page is talking a little bit more about trees and the fact that the trees don't need to look like what we drew when we were little kids, where it might be a little triangle or a very perfect tree, because most of the time trees have some variety to them. They might have broken branches or just have grown at an angle. So you know, just be careful that you're not making them too exactly similar. And then the bottom part of this is talking about the river part of things, and there is more information than what I've put on here, but basically you can have in the shallow water ripples that are moving over the rock, so you get lots of complex patterns. You might have a reflection of a tree in the water that's got a lot of movement to it. If it's a calm day and it's deeper water, then you might have a little bit more of a glassy look to the river, but that's a little more unusual. Generally, when something that is lighter is reflecting into the water, it's going to reflect darker. And if something is darker, like a tree trunk reflecting into the water, that reflection will be a little lighter than what the actual tree trunk is. So it's opposite of what the subject is doing. And then also water becomes less reflective the closer we are to it. So if you're standing right at the water edge, you might notice rocks under the water and things like that, whereas if you're farther back, then it looks more as a reflective surface. So that can make a difference too. And for this one, the image that we're going to paint first, having that, I'm not sure if it's a sunset or sunrise, but having that warm glow in the sky and the reflection down in the water can really help warm up a snow scene. And it does also affect some of the color that we're seeing in the snow scene, because that warm tone can change the color on the trees. It can give a little bit of warmth to the snow itself. We are going to start with, like I said, doing some little studies, and all I did was just drew a square that's it's about 3 by 3 approximately. So you don't have to be too specific with it, and I didn't draw my lines very darkly. The only places that I put some marks prior to doing anything else were these guys, and I'll show you those as we go along, so you have that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to protect everywhere else on this, because I'm going to spatter some masking fluid, and masking fluid can just get everywhere when you do this. And these are pieces of paper that I have used for masking before, so if you guys want to borrow them, and I can get out some more if needed. The other thing is, when you do this, it can be helpful to be able to see your masking fluid. And if you're using the creamier color mask, it is a little harder to see. So one of the things that you can do is take liquid mask, and normally I use the Winsor Newton Colourless art mask, and I like that because I don't want my masking fluid to kind of overtake the other colors on my painting. I would prefer not to have it have color. But there are times like this where if I'm spattering with a toothbrush, it makes such small little marks that it's nice to be able to see it. So you could use something like the Pebeo, which has blue in it, but this is really kind of strong. And if you only have the colorless, this is a way that you can adjust it. So usually what I will do is I will pour some into a container or a tray, and I will put a little bit of, get my tool here, put a little bit of watercolor with it. And because you can thin masking fluid with a little bit of water, but if you ever do that, you just need to be careful that you're just doing a little bit, because you can thin it so much that it's not going to work for you. It'll just peel off. So I'm going to get a very light and watery little bit of cobalt blue out, and then just let it kind of drip in there. I do not want to touch my paintbrush to the mask, because it can gum up my good brush and ruin it. Yeah. So you have to watch that, yeah. So I'm using my hors d'oeuvre pick that I apply masking fluid with to mix it up a little bit, and it still probably could have a little more color to it. One thing you can do is just kind of squeeze it and drip a little more in. Okay. All right, so it has a little bit of color. Get this down there too. I'm also going to be using this with a sponge, so I'm going to do this one and then do the other one, because the mask needs to dry before we can paint those areas. So I will dab it, and I'm just getting the front edge of my brush, and then I'm going to use my fingers underneath, and I like to sort of twist and turn the toothbrush as I'm splattering so that I get it not all coming off the same angle, because usually what happens is it wants to spray one direction. So I can kind of see where I've gotten it everywhere, and I wanted to put just a touch more on. If you ever put some on, like there's a big drop that's sitting right here, if this were on my paper, it's best just to leave it, let it dry, and then pull it off. Because if you try to do it while it's wet, it just usually makes a mess. So then you need to go clean your brush right away. I will do that, because it will stick to these bristles.
Something I'm not going to. There's a mask. I forgot my mask.
And yeah, and I have some. I have extra brushes if you guys want to try them. I used to let people borrow these, but then they started getting gummed up, and so I would prefer you use the other brushes. Okay. Then the other one I'm going to do right quick is put some mask on this one. So for this one up here, and I'll go ahead and just draw over my lines so that they're easier to see. I just did some trunks, and I would not draw this dark normally, but I wanted to put some trunks on the paper so that it kind of reminds me where my tree will be. But if some of the snow marks that I make with the masking fluid goes over this, I'm not going to worry about it. It's just more of a placement. So I'm just kind of doing a variety and having some thick and thin, having them not be too spaced evenly out. And the bottoms of the trunks are different heights. So I don't want them to be, you know, too regimented. Have some variety. And then for this one, the background kind of horizon area will be about, it's maybe a third of the way up, close to half. Just so that there is a demarcation between the area that will be the background and the foreground snow. Okay, so then for this, I'm going to grab one of these guys. And these aren't the best that I got out, but with sponges, with a sea sponge, usually this kind is better. I didn't have enough of these. When you use them, they get gummed up pretty good with the mask. So I got some that are, you know, if they don't survive, that's fine. But it also is one, if you can rinse it right after, sometimes they will be better. I can tell I've used this one before because it's got some real hard areas to it. So then you just want to wring it out pretty good, but make sure it's wet everywhere. And just find a spot that seems kind of interesting. And usually what I do is find the area that I'm going to use and then sort of squeeze it together, because otherwise it wants to just push out and not be, especially for a smaller painting like this. I may even want to turn it because I don't need that much room. Okay, and this is a little wet because this is sort of wet since I dripped color in. I'm going to just dry it a little bit, so I'm not putting too much color in there. And then it's going to get, you know, just enough color on there, and I'm going to use it again sort of toward the upper part of these, and since I can tell where I'm putting it, I can see if it's working or not. And that looks like it's going okay. Okay, so that will be, that is snow clumps on the tree branches is what I'm looking for there, not snow that is falling. And I'm going to clean it in the sink because you don't want to put masking fluid in your jar that you're using for your water. Okay. And if you guys all decide you want this sponge, then you'll just have to share. Okay, so I've got those two, and the last place that I could mask, and it is up to you guys whether or not you want to, and I am not going to just because I can paint around it. If it were a tree, I will show you actually what it will look like in smaller form. Here. So this is a bigger one. We're not going to do a full tree like this time. We're going to just do a smaller one. But this is a kind of tree where you might have big clumps of snow. So we are doing one that's more like this. So it's just, you know, got the three pieces. Yeah. And because my branches are dark enough that they can go over the lighter blue, I don't have to mask. And so I'm just going to paint around the whites of that snow. Okay, good there. All right, so this is probably pretty close to dry, but I think I'll start with this one and then we can go back to doing this one over here. And I will show you this one and then I'll have you guys go do your masking and then we'll come back and we can go from there. So this first one, we're going to do a sky and we'll try salt. I usually do not use salt, and I actually have never used salt in a painting, but I do know some people that like to use it, and it can work well for making it feel like snow, but very subtle snow. It's not going to be as white or perfect little round shapes as snow that you've put on with mask. So one of the things to think about with your skies for a snow scene is that you might have a gray sky, which is what we will do for this one. And this one, it's going to be sort of cool feeling. So I'm going to use Cerulean. And I still haven't decided exactly which one I want to use with it. I was playing with some colors last night. I think I'm going to use Cerulean and a little bit of a yellow, like it's an early morning feel. And I'm going to go with, I think I'm going to use my Quin Gold, because Quin Gold is a little muted and I don't want it too vibrant. The other one that I was playing with yesterday was Cerulean and Lemon, or Hansa Light. Lemon and Hansa Light are basically the same thing. So Lemon tends to be a little more opaque. And Hansa, I noticed, is transparent or semi-transparent, and so I changed mine to Hansa. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I have the salt ready. And so this is just regular table salt, and it is, since it's very small, you're going to get smaller marks with it. You could use, I have coarse salt and I also have pretzel salt, and you'll get different looks with those. And so if you want to try something else, I'll have those available. Let me get a little bit of this out. I'm kind of clumped together. I don't know if it got wet or something, but okay. So I'm going to take some water and just wet that shape. And because we're doing smaller shapes, you may not want to use a really big brush when you're doing this. All right. So just kind of getting wet everywhere, and then when you go to put your paint on, because I've pulled my paint out and it's ready, it's moving on my palette, it would probably drip a little bit. I'm actually going to dry the back of my brush for this first pass, and that, it did take off a little color because of where I had it, but that will take the moisture out and not take as much color off of my brush. And if you want to leave some openings, like there's clouds, you can do that. And then as I come down to the bottom, I'm going to leave some space for my yellow. And I actually think I'm going to put a little more water with that yellow because I don't want it too dark. I just want it to be barely there. And if you don't want to put the yellow in and you just want to play with Cerulean, or if you want to try a different mix of colors, feel free. The problem with the yellow is you have to be careful how you're stroking it on, because you could make green very quickly. So I have that, and then I'm going to dry this just a touch at the bottom, because if I try to put the salt on when it's really drippy wet, it's going to just kind of suck up the salt and it won't work. So there's a fine line of when you apply it, and I'm not always got it. So at the top edge, I can go ahead and apply some because it's starting to dry. I don't know if I can do that down in the bottom just yet, so I have to give it a few more seconds. And I'll try some down in the bottom. It may not be enough, or may not be dry enough. Okay. So then that has to dry completely. So before you can remove any of the salt, it can't be too dry when you apply the salt, because it won't work. If it's too wet, it won't work. So there's this fine, like it's just semi-shiny looking. You apply the salt and then you leave it to dry. Then once it's done its thing, you should end up with these little kind of starry looking shapes that appear, and basically what it's doing, it's wicking up the color around it. And then once it's dry, then you can knock the salt off of it. Okay, so I will let you guys kind of go get started, and I'll turn this around so you can see. If anyone wants a picture of it, you can go ahead and do that. And if you are waiting, and if you do take a picture or you want to come back up and look, you can go ahead and sort of get these other ones started, laid out, because I don't have a handout of this to give you. So mine is dry now, and with salt, I would say if you're doing something with salt and you're going to keep painting in that area, I would let the sky dry, remove the salt, and then paint your trees or whatever else you have. Because otherwise you're going to be picking up salt and it could change what's happening on your paper. So I'm just going to knock that off. I'm not going to have us paint anything on that, but if you wanted to, once we're trying some of these trees down here, if you want to use that sky as a background to paint some trees, you're welcome to do that. And it will be a little stuck depending on your salt and how much you used. Okay.
What kind did you use?
I just used the table salt, so the small stuff. And I don't know how well it will show up on the video. Let me see if I can raise this up a little bit. I don't know if it'll make a difference, but yeah, I don't know if it's focusing very well. But basically, I got just little white areas that kind of look like it's snowing. And it's very subtle. If you wanted something a little stronger, sometimes it may be using darker colors in the sky or the heavier, coarser salt to get a stronger effect. So for this sky over here, I'm going to use, you could use ultramarine, but I'm going to use cobalt and burnt sienna. So I'm going to make a gray or a gray blue from that mix. And you probably can't see my palette right now. Let's see if I can move this over just a little. There we go. Okay. So I've got the cobalt out, and I'm going to pull some burnt sienna out. You could also use burnt umber with this. I just tend to use the burnt sienna. And the only reason I'm using cobalt is because I don't necessarily want it to look really, really dark, like it's a really stormy sky. So I'm just going to use the lighter blue because ultramarine is darker. So. All right, so I've got some of each of those out. I'm going to be using more of the cobalt in the mix than the burnt sienna because I don't want it to feel like a brown sky. And that can happen, yes. Yeah, smog. All right, so I'm also going to wet this, and because you could decide, well, I want some white clouds in there, but it also, depending on how big your sky is, it will help you get the color on without it having hard edges. Okay, and this is over the masked spots of snow that we did with the toothbrush. So this, when it dries, will look like it's snowing. All right, so I've made sort of a blue-gray from my mix, and I'm going to just start up at the top and maybe leave some cloud. And depending on how wet your paper it is, it may look like those clouds are raining or snowing in this case. Grapple, like we get in Colorado. All right, so I'm going to leave that a little more in there. Okay, and then for this area over here, I am going to paint in the tops of my trees first, and then I could paint the background area around it, because if I paint the background first, then it's just easier to paint the tops of the trees, basically, because of where your snow is. It will help sort of inform you where your tree has branches. And because these are distant trees, I am not trying to make each little branch necessarily. It's going to sort of be a mass of shape going across it. And I will use, you could use ultramarine and quin gold to give you sort of an evergreen color. You could use ultramarine and sap green. Ultramarine this time because I want it to be a darker foliage color back there. So instead of the cobalt, I'm going with the ultramarine. And I'm going to get out my quin gold. If you don't have quin gold, you can use a warm yellow like New Gamboge with a little bit of burnt sienna in it, and that will neutralize the New Gamboge and get it close to the quin gold look. It won't necessarily give you exactly that. Okay. And you probably can't see that on my palette right now, but I've pulled out the ultramarine, and I will get out the Quin Gold. And for these colors, I don't want a ton of water in them. And I've got this is a number 16 brush, but you might want to move down to a smaller brush at this point. But this guy gets a small enough point that I can use it for this and still be okay with it. I'm going to move this over here for a second. So when I mix the ultramarine and the Quin Gold, I'm getting sort of a deep evergreen color. All right, and then I'm going to dry the back of my brush just because I don't want it too wet. I have not wet the paper or anything, and I'm thinking of a tree that has branches that sort of come down like this. For these guys, especially when they're snow laden, they're not going to necessarily have branches that are pointing upward. So that just helps remind me, and I'm painting right over the masked area, and I'm thinking of creating a tree, and I'm not totally ignoring where the snow is, but I'm not worried if I'm thinking, okay, there's a branch coming down here, I just bring it right over the masked area, because that way I know that the snow will be on that area. Okay.
That's a pretty color.
Yeah. And sometimes going a little bluer in places is nice as well, so that you get some variety. This has got a little more blue in this part of it. And then I would just move that over a little bit. Okay, and then I'm going to basically go to all the trees. And because these guys are tall and farther back, you may have some branches that come down lower, some that are higher, depending on your tree. Don't feel like you have to bring the branches all the way down to the bottom. But if you want to have a few here and there that are toward the bottom, or that also cross over the front of the tree, like that one just did, that is good to do, because then it'll make it feel like the trunk is within the tree and not sticking just in front of it. So, okay. And I'm going to go back to the blue, just for variety. So all I did there was I did not clean my brush, and I just went back over to my mixed area and got some blue on the brush. And then if I want more yellow in the mix, I can go back and get a little more yellow. So I am looking where the snow, where my masked area ended up, and trying to sort of put some branching happening around that. If I pull my mask off and it's not quite matching up, then maybe I have to make some adjustments at that point. Okay, and I think there was just kind of a bunch of mask over in this corner. There's a tree maybe off the edge or something, so, all right. And because these are background trees, I'm not worried about them being too exact. It's more just the idea of them. All right, so that has to dry before I could put in the background color. So let me dry it with a blow dryer, and I'll show you the background on there, and then I'll have you guys go back, because the next part of this would be putting in the trunks and putting some shadow on the foreground snow, but I need to do that other part first. Okay, so I have dried both of these, and I'm going to remove the masking that's on here so you can see it snow. And it may be subtle because of how little it is.
Just
need it, everything.
I'm surprised I was here.
I'm glad you came.
I feel like that happens.
Okay, so let me lift that up just a little bit. But yeah,
that's
you can see
nice.
it. So that it's, yeah, it has a really nice feel like it's snowing, and it's a quick way to do it. So before I would remove the mask here, was there a question?
Is that how you would do Stars at Night in the Sky too?
Yep, it's great for that. In fact, I was working with someone, she wanted to do a Milky Way, and so we used mask first and then did the Milky Way using that. So yeah, and you have to be a little more directional when you're doing the Milky Way to get things where you want it, but yeah, that's a good way to do it. You can also use this if you're doing like a sandy path or something like that. So I will spritz the mask on first so that you end up with light stones or a little, looks like sand or something like that. So, okay, so for this, I'm actually going to use my smaller brush because I just have little areas back there. And because these are in the background and I want them to feel like it's a colder, snowy area and they're in the background, I'm going to use you could use either ultramarine or cobalt, and I'm going to use it with my warm red, which for me is Perol Scarlet, but it might be cadmium red, or some people have vermilion. And I'm making a kind of muted purple with it. And the warm red with a blue that's on the purpler side of blue will create a more muted purple. And it can go from purple to purple blue. I could also put a little bit of the cerulean in that back in here. And I'm going to just, because this is a small area and I'm just trying to do this sort of fast, I'm putting it in, but I'm also going to just leave little openings here and there. And I just grab just a touch of cerulean, and then I'll go back to the purple. And I'm going around my evergreen branches. And so these would be other trees that are back here that have snow on them, or things that are in the background that we can't, you know, that are just blurred all together. Okay, and just a little bit there. And that way I can kind of fill in around the tree trunks and the tree branches that I created. Okay. So just a little variety back and forth. And it could be sky that we're seeing through there, or distant hills. So I would just kind of fill all of that in and go across it. So instead of me doing, you guys watching me do it, I will have you guys go do yours. And this side over here, there's no background area. So once I take the mask off, you can see that depending on how much, it may be like really big areas. So then you may have to go back in and adjust. So that would be where I would go use that green to go in and make those clumps behave, basically. Make them more what I want them to be. And so just thinning them down with some marks here and there to make it feel more like tree needles, pine needles in there. And then once that was all dry, then we can come back in and we're actually going to shadow a little bit, because those are so small it's hard to get a brush in there. So a little water, and then you can use a little bit of blue in places to go in and shadow. And I would pick, so if your light's coming from this direction, and I'll show you with the shadows on the snow on the foreground when you come back up, and we'll talk about that a little more, but just to give you a hint of what's coming. So go ahead and do this sky, and then you can do your trees over here and dry it, and then work on the background, and then I'll have you come back up. Okay, so I have the trees with the background color in there. It depends on how much of green you put in for your foliage, whether or not you have much background, or if you may just have some at the bottom. Really kind of depends on the scene, but for me, I filled in a few places. And then I've dried it, and before I remove the mask, I was showing you how you could remove it here and put some color. That was probably premature, because it's best to go ahead and put your trunks in. If you have removed the mask, it doesn't hurt anything, because you just have to remember to go ahead and put some trunks in a few places. So we'll see, because I can't tell if there's mask over that. In fact, I might go ahead and remove. Oh yeah, look how big that is. I'm glad I did that.
Oh, big clumps.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, so if you're working on a scene that is really small like this, I would test your mask on the sponge on a separate area. So if you have, if you have a painting where this is going to be your background texture, just test your sponge so that you know. It might be, if you're doing background trees and they're this small, that you might want to just use a tool with some mask and go in and put the mask on there rather than a sponge. If these were bigger trees, like I have, let me find it. Too many. Okay. If they were bigger trees like this, some of that may still be a little large, but some of those bigger marks would work on, you know, the scaled up size. So then, once you've removed the mask, if it is too large, you want to adjust things, that's where I would come in with your color for your branches and just fill in and take out some of the large shapes prior to doing anything else. Then I would let that dry. And then you could go in and give some of the snow some color. So because this is a smaller shape, I'll go ahead and do that. Sometimes I use cerulean a lot with snow. So I might use just straight cerulean and shadow part of that piece. And it may not be real apparent when you're back from it, but when you have filled in some of your, let me find a smaller one, snow shapes with just a little bit of shadow color, and it might not be pure cerulean the whole way through. The other thing I will do is cobalt and a touch of Quin Rose, because you can make a purple, and I'll usually have it more on the blue side of purple, not real red. And a little bit of that purpley color in to shadow some of those snow clumps is a good way to give them a little bit of form. Otherwise, they're going to look flat. And so then what I would do is, you can do it two ways if you know where your shadows are coming from. So I'm going to pretend my light is coming from this direction, so my shadow from my tree trunks is going to be going off the left side. Then, because it's lighter, I would probably put the shadow in first, just because it's a lighter shape rather than putting the tree trunk in first. But if it helps you to see your tree trunk, to know, okay, I need to put a mark there for the shadow. And you might also see some of the branches, depending on where, you know, and so you can have a variety of colors. And generally depends on the snow and whether or not the shadow shape is softened in places, or if it's hard-edged everywhere, how far out from the tree it's coming. All of that can make a difference. And so I would put the shadows in. Let me just do that right quick, and then I'll dry it. And I'm just going to pretend. It helps if you have an image before you to be able to tell where everything is. So right now we're just kind of making this all up, so don't worry if it doesn't feel exact. Coming from the bottom of the tree, and then this last one, and then there may be some tree trunks that are off your edge over here that would add some color to the foreground. So maybe there's a big canopy of trees over on the right that is causing this foreground area to have more shadow, which gives it more interest. So I'm going to just put some color down in there just so that it feels like it's in shadow. Okay, so then I will dry that, and I'll show you one of the trunks, and then we'll go on. So one of the mixes that I like to use for tree trunks is Ultramarine and Burnt Sienna. You could also use Quin Magenta, Burnt Sienna, and Ultramarine. And that will give you a different look. But for a basic tree trunk color, using the Burnt Sienna, or you can use Burnt Umber and Ultramarine. That works well as the Burnt Sienna and Ultramarine. but basically depending on the tree trunk. So because my trunks are lighter on the right side, I'm going to use, because these are so small, I'm not going to pre-wet this, but I'm going to use the slightly warmer, and I could even make it lighter color on the right for my trunks. And then, yeah, it's a little tiny brush too. This is a 4. And then I'm going to use a darker version of that with the ultramarine and more burnt sienna on the left side for the shadow side. So depending on how small your trunks are, whether or not you can get in there and give it some form with that. So generally you're going to have a lighter side, maybe warmer on the sunlit side, and then a little cooler and darker on the shadow side. And just having a little variety in the trunks is interesting as well. So, you know, if they're not all exactly the same color, that can be interesting. But some forests, they are very similar. And then as you come down to the bottom, don't forget that the bottom of your snow sometimes is mounded up, or it may have a depression where the snow has come. So if that happens, which we can see in the image we will be doing, I would use maybe a little bit of cobalt and the rose, maybe just a touch of the burnt sienna so it's not too vibrant, to make sort of a purple color, and then you might see sort of a shadowed side where the snow is kind of in a depression around the tree trunk. But also, if you're just doing tree trunks, don't make them too straight, flat across the bottom. Give them a little bit of form at the bottom so it looks like there's maybe some snow mounding up. Okay, so I'm not going to do all of those. I'm going to go do this deciduous tree, and then I'll have you guys go back. So when you're doing deciduous trees, they have main branches, they have the trunk, and then they have lots of little branches. And those little branches can make sort of a mass of, it's seen best in this one, where it becomes almost a mass of color. And because these are far enough back, we're not going to see all those little individual branches. So you can create these, you can try either brush, I'll show you both, a round or a flat. And I'm going to use my burnt sienna, and I have not pre-drawn anything here. If you wanted to draw where a tree trunk is or give yourself basically the shape of the canopy, you could do that. But I'm just going to sort of go in, and I don't want it too dark, so I'm going to lighten that.
What are you using again?
I am using burnt sienna, and it may have a little bit of the ultramarine in it. And basically I'm just giving myself masses of shape, and very light, because I don't want them too dark or they're going to look, they won't look airy like they're in the distance and maybe lots of little branches together. They should feel kind of light, not too dark. Okay, so there's that using a round brush, and it has some random shape to it. It's not really, I don't want it to be too perfect. And then this one is using a flat, same kind of thing. I don't want it to have too much color in it. And it would be turning your brush to get some variation maybe to it. You could try just, if I can turn the board, just putting the brush down and getting form that way as well. But I would play with your brushes and see what you like, what works for you. I have not done a painting with very many deciduous trees in it from winter. I tend to like the evergreens, so it's not in my wheelhouse necessarily. All right. And then I'm using the ultramarine and the burnt sienna just to make a darker color. And generally I would wait for this to dry, but I'm going to go ahead and make a trunk and then just bring up branches. And at this point, I'm coming actually away from instead of going down, I'm coming up and away and doing little kind of broken marks, and that helps make it feel like the branches are not perfect. You don't want them to be too straight necessarily. Depends on the tree, but okay. And also, if you have it go in between where the branch is not continuous, have a broken area, then it will feel like the foliage or the smaller branches are creating an area where the bigger branches are going in between. So same thing for this one. And maybe I'll make a shorter tree for this one. It has some bigger branches that come off of it. Depending on your tree trunk, you might see different shapes. And if you have a liner brush, they are really good for doing tree branches.
I do at home.
Where did my other one go? There it is. So these guys are liners or scripts. This one's called a script, and I believe this one is too. So this one is really funky looking.
Interesting.
And it is because when you get it, sorry, I'm probably spraying you. A little bit of extra water, help you grow, right? Keep you moist. So this is thicker in here because it will hold more pigment. So that one you would kind of load up and really get the pigment in here so that you can go a long way with it.
What is that one called?
It's called a script,
Oh.
and it's by Sharf. It's a company in Sri Lanka. So I had to send away for it. It's SCHARFF, and it's number 4 script, and it has a number 738 on it. And it's called a supreme script. So you'd be fancy with this one. And that one, so this one would be really good if you like doing things like a city scene, or if you're doing lots of deciduous trees and you want to have the ability just to go in there and keep painting with it. So if anybody wants to try that one, you're welcome to. This one is by Silver Black Velvet, and it's number 1, and it is a script. And so what a script brush is that their bristles are long and thin, and they have a lot of give to them because you want it to sort of break when you're using it. So when you're
different than a rigger.
it's very similar to a rigger. Okay. So yeah, so some call them riggers. I don't know exact difference between a rigger and a script, but yeah, I think I have one in here that may be called a rigger.
Okay.
Where is it? Here it is. Let's see if you're a script or a rigger. Doesn't say. And this is a cheaper one that I've had for a long time. So yeah, I'm not sure, but so basically when you're using them, from my understanding is that if you hold it like this, where you don't have a lot of control and you're not got a really firm grip on it, you're going to get a more natural line.
Okay.
So then if you're making lines, you get a more calligraphic looking mark, a more interesting mark from it.
Good to know.
Yeah, so just playing with it, and obviously this is a little small of a tree to do much with, but yeah, so I will have these if you guys want to try them. I'll put them out. So I will have you guys go try those, or let's see, 3. Yeah, let's do that. I'll have you try those, and then we may not get to any of the rest of these today, so we'll continue, but we'll see where we're at in a little bit. Okay. I'll put these out. Okay. So just real quick, I wanted to talk about the drawing for the scene we're going to do. I have mine on my paper. It's probably a little light to see, but hopefully it's viewable up there. And then it should be light. It shouldn't be too dark. And from the drawing that I sent you guys, I transferred it using my light table, but if you use transfer paper, you can, or if you want to draw it yourself, you can. And this is the image we're working from. And this is not mine. This was a copyright-free image that I got from, wasn't Pixabay. I'll have to look it up and let you guys know because this was a different site that I found. And if you go on sites like Pixabay or it's Pixabay, I think. Maybe Pixeb, you'll have to look it up. But the other site, both of them, they have a buy me a coffee button where you can actually go and donate to the photographer. So if you end up, maybe you get one from someone and you don't feel like you have to buy them coffee, but any little bit is nice because they're giving you their image for free to work from. So then this is a cropped image, and I also went in and cleaned up something over in here, I think, because there was a tree
Somebody's
that,
phone, I think it's.
yeah,
Sorry, I get spam calls. I just have to let it
ignore
go.
it. So I have not
really
masked anything. So the one thing I will be doing is how we did the mask up here with flicking it on with a toothbrush. I'm going to just cover my edges with some paper and flick mask on there because I decided I wanted to make it look like it's going to snow.
Oh,
I like
pretty.
that idea.
Yeah. Now, if you decide that you also want to have snow on some of these branches, then you could do that. I would use maybe one of these pictures in the handout to give you an idea of maybe what that might look like. And then I would probably go in with a tool to apply the mask, not a sponge at this point, because it's going to be a little too random. And you could go in and put some snow in places on there. And then that would make it look like the trees have snow on them. These are very silhouetted. So any snow that you would put on there, the majority of that snow, once you remove the mask, is going to be shadowed. It'll just be the edges on the outside, maybe just a little rim light on the edges of that snow that would be lit. So just know that it's not going to be as white as we might think, because most of the snow down here has color on it. There's just a little bit that's not. And then we are going to work with this next time, not the painting yet. We're going to do a color study. And we'll talk about what colors you might or might not use. So if you want to start playing with your paint, you can do that. And then I will let you know what colors I've used. And if you decide next time, oh, I don't have that color, I think I'm going to get that color, go ahead. But you might find something you like just as well. And because really there's not always just one solution that will work. And so we'll talk about it, and if you just can't seem to quite get what you want, we'll kind of talk about what all is going on with this. And so we'll see where we get next time, but we will finish these guys and do a color study and maybe try some colors or talk about colors, and then we'll go from there. So I would have this with you just in case, but it may not be till the third class that we get to it. So anything else for that? Okay. And I'll have this up here if you want to see it.